Hello, I'm Nami Ogawa at the University of Tokyo, Japan. I've made a presentation of a paper on behalf of the co-authors. The script for this talk will be read by Amazon Polly.
Room scale VR allows users to walk around freely while reflecting their actual movements in the virtual environment. Such a natural walking experience improves the user's sense of presence, but sometimes it is necessary to limit the user's movement. For example, it is important to ensure that the user does not bump into any real-life obstacles since empty space in a real room is typically limited. Therefore, a virtual wall is usually displayed to indicate the boundaries of the safe area. However, as the virtual walls do not physically obstruct users, the user often tries to walk through the virtual walls. Considering these safety and design constraints, preventing users from walking through virtual walls is considered an important issue in a room-scale virtual environment. So far, few attempts have been made to solve this problem. While conventional video games limit the movement of virtual characters and cameras, the same strategy cannot simply be applied to room-scale VR, as asynchronous movements between the user and the virtual camera can cause motion sickness. Turkdeck is a technique for providing physical feedback on a virtual wall, but it's not very practical as it requires a lot of manpower. Recently, Bolt et al. Have shown that a combination of visual, auditory, and vibrotactile feedback for wall collisions can be effective in preventing users from walking through walls. However, it can disrupt the sense of immersion. Thus, the existing approaches to room-scale VR essentially relies on explicit sensory feedback from wall collisions. In contrast, this study aims to guide the user's behavior without explicit feedback or instruction for wall collisions. How is this possible? Our idea is to encourage the users to behave realistically in virtual environments. In other words, we aim to encourage the users to instinctively avoid hitting the walls, which is a natural behavior toward walls. In the real world, no one would try to bump into a wall, would they? So, how can we implicitly affect the user's behavior? To put it differently, what determines the way the users behave in a virtual environment? The key to our idea is the sense of presence. Presence is commonly defined as the sense of being there, but it is also operationally defined as the state in which the user responds realistically to events in the virtual environment. Here, the response can be subjective, physiological, and behavioral. In other words, if participants in the virtual environment behave as if they were in an equivalent real environment, this is a sign of presence. Therefore, we assume that inducing a higher level of presence would discourage the users from walking through walls. This is because if the users believe that the virtual wall actually exists, they won't even think about passing through it. In presence research, the importance of the realism of self-avatars has long been established. Therefore, we decided to focus on the self-avatars to enhance the sense of presence and investigate the effect of the appearance of the self-avatars on the user's walk-through wall behavior. Now, let's take a look at what is known so far about the effect of self-avatar appearances. Previous studies have shown that the visibility of the self-avatar affects the sense of presence. Specifically, when a self-avatar is displayed, users feel a greater sense of presence than when a self-avatar is not displayed. However, in recent VR applications, rather than not displaying any self-avatars at all, it is common to display at least partial self-avatars such as controllers and virtual hands. Therefore, we decided to compare partial and full body representations as a factor of visibility in this study. On the other hand, the psychological effects of the realism of a self-avatar have been well studied recently in studies on the sense of embodiment, rather than presence studies. A number of studies have suggested that anthropomorphism of a self-avatar affects the sense of body ownership, which is the sense of one's self-attribution of a body. Fundamentally, the closer the appearance of a self-avatar is to one's own body, the stronger the sense of body ownership will be. However, in the case of full-body self-avatars, the uncanny valley effect has been observed in recent studies of body ownership illusions. In addition, for presence, the effects of anthropomorphism have been shown to be complex and dependent on the gender of the user. Therefore, in addition to a visibility factor, we decided to compare abstract and realistic self-avatars as an anthropomorphism factor. Considering these backgrounds, we conducted an experiment to investigate how the appearances of a self-avatar affect the user's walk-through wall behaviors in a room-scale virtual environment. The hypothesis is that self-avatars with higher visual fidelity increase the user's sense of presence, and make the participants more likely to behave in a virtual environment in the same way as they would in a real environment, that is, more likely to avoid collisions with walls. Conversely, self-avatars with lower visual fidelity decrease the user's sense of presence, and make the participants less likely to behave in a virtual environment as they would in a real environment, that is, more likely to walk through walls. In the next few slides, I'll explain the task and the design of the experiment. The task was to push buttons in numerical order. Here's an example of the experimental scene. The successive buttons were spatially close but separated by the wall, so the participants had to walk back and forth. However, as you can see, this was time-consuming and exhausting, so some participants took the shortcut by walking through the wall. In this way, the participants were encouraged to walk through the walls while performing the task in a total of 4 rooms. We designed the rooms so that the incentive to pass through the walls got greater as the participants moved on to the next room. For example, the video shown in the previous slide represented room 2. In contrast, room 1 had a relatively small number of buttons, so the incentives were relatively small. Room 3, on the other hand, had buttons that they couldn't press unless they walked through an automatic sliding wall. Room 4 also could not be completed without walking through the wall, and this was more explicit than room 3. But, the main purpose of room 4 was to provide the participants with threatening stimuli to assess their physiological responses. In addition, we set a time limit for each room. These tasks and rooms were designed with reference to the study by Bolt et al. The participants' full body movements were tracked by 3 trackers and handheld controllers and reflected in their self-avatar in inverse kinematics. At the beginning of the experiment, the participants had 30 seconds to look in the virtual mirror while moving their bodies freely. This procedure was taken to ensure the embodiment of the self-avatar. We prepared 4 types of avatars, and each participant was assigned to any one of the 4. For the realistic avatars, we used avatars that matched the gender of the participants. In this way, the experiment followed a 2x2 between subjects design that controlled the appearance of self-avatars, namely, anthropomorphism and visibility. We analyzed the tendency of the participants to walk through the walls in each room using motion tracking data. This behavioral analysis was the primary concern of the experiment. In addition, we analyzed subjective scores for presence and body ownership using a questionnaire, and physiological responses to the virtual threats using the skin conductance response as an indicator of the sense of presence and body ownership. However, physiological analysis will be omitted in this talk, so please read the paper for details. So far, I've explained the methods. Now, what are the results? Here, you can see the results of the behavioral data. These graphs show the percentage of the participants by behavioral pattern, by the type of avatar, in each room. First, let's compare the distributions by room to figure out the general trend. If you look at the orange area, which represents the portion of the participants who walked through the wall, you can see that more and more participants walked through the walls as the experiment progressed. This indicates that each room could give incentives to walk through the wall to the participants, as expected. However, what is more important here is the difference in distribution by avatar type. Thus, let's take a closer look at the graph for room 2, where the effect of self-avatar is clearly demonstrated. In room 2, the participants' behaviors were classified into 3 categories. Walking through the wall, penetrating their hand into the wall, but never walking through the wall, and neither touching nor walking through the wall, that is, walking around the wall. As you can see, the realistic full-body self-avatar was the most effective for discouraging the participants from penetrating the walls, which supported the hypothesis. Another interesting result was that the participants with the human hand avatar were likely to walk through the walls, although the participants with the controller avatar did not show such a tendency. What about another room? Let's take a look at room 3. The realistic full-body self-avatar also seemed to be the most effective in room 3, but a simple binary counting is not enough to fully capture the characteristics of their behavior. How can we get a deeper understanding of user behavior? In fact, among the participants who walked through the wall, some took a long time to finally walk through the wall, while others walked through the wall immediately without hesitation. Therefore, we analyzed when the participants first walked through the wall in room 3. Here, we have the graph showing how long it took the participants to walk through the wall for the first time in room 3 by avatar type. As you can see, the participants with the realistic full-body self-avatar took more time to walk through the walls than the other participants. What is interesting here is that this does not include the data on the participants who did not walk through the wall. We performed a similar analysis of behavioral patterns for the other rooms as well, but ratios were not the main indicator for these rooms, so please read the paper for the results. Finally, using the time indicator, we analyzed the time it took the participants to first walk through the wall, throughout the experiment, as an indicator of behavioral trends throughout the experiment. Here is the graph showing the time it took for the participants to first walk through the wall, throughout the experiment. As you can see, the participants with the realistic full-body self-avatar took longer to walk through the walls than the other participants, even throughout the experiment. So far, I've shown the results of the behavioral data analysis, which is the main concern of the experiment. To put it simply, as evident from the ratio in room 2, time in room 3, and time across rooms, the results consistently showed that participants who had the full-body human avatar tended to refrain from walking through the walls. These supported our hypothesis that self-avatars with higher visual fidelity make users less likely to walk through walls. Yet, it's not yet clear whether this effect is due to the sense of presence. Let's turn to the questionnaire results. These graphs show the participants' subjective ratings of sense of presence and sense of body ownership for each self-avatar. For presence, there was no significant difference between the avatar conditions, unlike behavioral data. The results did not support our hypothesis that the more realistic and visible the self-avatars, the stronger the sense of presence they induced. In addition, the participants with abstract avatars were shown to have a stronger sense of body ownership than those with realistic avatars. This is in contrast to the results of a number of previous studies showing that realistic self-avatars induce a greater sense of body ownership than abstract self-avatars. Then, does presence have nothing to do with behavior? In fact, a correlation analysis revealed a significant weak correlation between presence and behavior indices. In addition, multiple regression analysis showed that only the score of presence tended to predict the participant's behavior, among the variables from the questionnaire and the physiological response data. In line with our hypothesis, the results showed that the participants with a higher sense of presence tended to take a longer time to walk through the wall. In the next slide, I'd like to summarize the results of our experiment. Overall, the results showed that the realistic full-body self-avatar was the most effective in discouraging the participants from penetrating the walls. In addition, the participants with a higher sense of presence tended to refrain from passing through the walls, although there were no significant differences in the subjective ratings of presence across avatar conditions. These results support our idea that self-avatars with higher fidelity can discourage users from walking through virtual walls without explicit feedback. Yet, there are some unexpected results that warrant further discussion. For instance, the ratio index in room 2 showed that participants with the human hand avatar were more likely to walk through the walls, while participants with the controller avatar did not show such a trend. This result was contrary to expectations, as the controller avatar should be farthest away from the full-body realistic avatar in terms of visual resemblance to the human body. How can we explain this result? This may be related to the unexpected results of the questionnaire showing that the abstract self-avatars evoked a stronger sense of body ownership than the realistic self-avatars. One possible reason for this is the uncanny valley effect. This could explain the results, especially the comparison between full-body avatars. However, in the case of hand-only avatars, there is another possible reason. It is an input modality. In this study, as the participants held the actual controllers, the controller avatars may be more realistic than human hand avatars. In fact, previous studies that have shown the effect of anthropomorphism of virtual hands usually used hand tracking sensors instead of controllers. Therefore, the inclusion of input modality as a factor is a future prospect. Future studies also include improving presence by using other factors such as passive haptics and avatar personalization. Finally, what do our results tell us about the effect of self-avatars on user behavior in virtual environments more generally? The results of this study provide evidence that self-avatars with high visual fidelity induce realistic user behavior, presumably through a higher sense of presence. Therefore, this study can contribute to VR applications that require realistic user responses in virtual environments, such as a training system. The results also indicate that a VR designer can implicitly encourage users to behave realistically or unrealistically depending on the situation by simply changing the self-avatars. The findings can be applied to behavioral therapy techniques for treating phobias, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which includes graded exposure of the patient to stimuli. I'd like to finish by showing the recap of this talk.
Thank you for watching the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.